Throughout history, a disturbing pattern has repeatedly led powerful empires to their downfall, spanning over 5,600 years. Today, in 2025, the United States appears to be on a similar trajectory, progressing through the same stages, with setbacks and challenges echoing past collapses, like following an ancient, destructive playbook. Historically, from 370 to 880 AD, Rome's legions were regarded as the most formidable military force on Earth. They had expanded across 3 continents, conquering countless kingdoms, and no rival could stand against them. Yet, their seemingly unbreakable power was shattered at the Battle of Adrianople, a single catastrophic defeat that marked the beginning of their decline. Less than 3 decades later, Rome was sacked, and the Western Roman Empire crumbled just 7 years after that. The once invincible military became a subject of mockery and legend. Similarly, in 1940, France boasted Europe's largest and most advanced army, with the Maginot Line believed to be an impenetrable fortress. French generals saw their military as the world's finest. But within 6 weeks, Germany invaded through strategic bypasses, and the myth of French invincibility was shattered. The rapid conquest left France a puppet state virtually overnight, exemplifying how internal weaknesses can quickly surface under external pressure. Fast forward to 1979, the Soviet Union was a global superpower, wielding enormous nuclear arsenals, maintaining the largest ground forces, and dominating Eastern Europe for decades. However, their attempt to quickly pacify Afghanistan turned into a protracted, humiliating quagmire lasting 10 years. When they finally withdrew in disgrace, their empire's military reputation was irreparably damaged, leading to the disintegration of the Soviet Union within 2 years, a collapse driven by military failure. In each of these instances, Rome, France, and the USSR, the collapses followed a strikingly similar sequence. The key point to grasp is that the modern United States, which has held global military dominance for nearly 8 decades, is exhibiting all the warning signs that appeared before those historical collapses. We are no longer at the beginning of this pattern. Instead, we are at stage 4 of 6, precisely where the mighty empire's myth of invincibility was shattered. This is the same stage where France's military was revealed as hollow, where the Soviet Union's military strength crumbled amid the chaos of Afghanistan, and where the false veneer of unassailability was stripped away from Rome's legions. Understanding how empires lose their military dominance requires more than a theoretical perspective. It demands seeing what specific decline looks like in practice. Military collapse doesn't usually start with an outright battlefield defeat, but begins internally, an erosion of strength hidden beneath a facade of power. This decline manifests through budget cuts disguised as efforts toward efficiency, recruitment difficulties blamed on cultural factors, aging equipment, and a stagnation or slowdown in procurement. Standards for training and readiness steadily diminish, all while the military continues to show off bases, boast about advanced weaponry, and deliver confident speeches. Yet beneath that surface, the foundational weaknesses are quietly festering. The critical turning point comes during a conflict that unexpectedly reveals the growing divide between reputation and reality. An unthinkable defeat, one that should not have occurred, exposes the vulnerabilities that were once hidden. Suddenly, the empire's military strength is questioned as enemies seize opportunities, and allies start to doubt the guarantees of protection that once seemed infallible. This exposes a harsh truth. The veneer of invincibility collapses, and the reality underneath emerges with brutal clarity. Throughout history, the pattern repeats. Once a major military setback occurs, a cascade of subsequent defeats often follows, weakening alliances, eroding confidence, and inviting external challengers to test boundaries. The once dominant military power finds itself unable to project force effectively, with bases closing, commitments being abandoned, and enemies acting with impunity. The empire, once seemingly unstoppable, retreats into its core territory or disintegrates entirely. Both in ancient Rome and more recent empires, the pattern of decline is rapid once the initial internal weaknesses surface. Rome's fall from stage 4 to stage 6 took about a century, France's final collapse following the 940 invasion happened within just 6 weeks, and the Soviet Union unraveled in roughly 2 years after Afghanistan. Each collapse was increasingly swift, a sign of how accelerating technology, communication, and geopolitical shifts compressed the timeline for decline. Currently, the United States is at stage 4, the point where internal weaknesses are evident, and the myth of invincibility is cracking. The early signs are unmistakable: aging equipment, struggling recruitment, declining readiness, and internal political and morale issues. The recent chaos and rapid fall of Afghan forces after 20 years and $2 trillion of investment demonstrate a stark disconnect between national reputation and actual military capability. The world sees these failures, and the signs of eroding dominance are clear. As history warns, once a military power's reputation begins to crack, it often triggers a domino effect, testing boundaries, facing multiple simultaneous challenges, and losing the ability to uphold its global commitments. Allies start to hedge or drift away, enemies test the limits without fear, and the superpower's influence diminishes rapidly. The timeline is alarming. Rome's collapse took a few decades, the USSR's downfall just a couple of years after Afghanistan, and France's surrender in 6 weeks. Now, with the speed of modern geopolitics and technology, that descent could accelerate further. If the current pattern persists, America's global dominance might well expire within the next 5 to 10 years. Once Stage 5, characterized by a cascade of defeats and loss of influence, begins, the final stage is inevitable. This involves losing the capacity to project power, shrinking influence, and ultimately retreating to defensive postures while the era of American hegemony ends. While this isn't predetermined, history shows that avoiding total collapse requires an honest assessment of internal weaknesses and bold restructuring. Unlike Rome, France, and the USSR, which all believed their reputation would shield them indefinitely, the pattern is rooted in hard mathematics, not in exceptionalism or destiny. When a superpower's military infrastructure erodes due to neglect, equipment aging, recruitment faltering, readiness declining, it becomes vulnerable. Once reputation is false strength, the entire empire risks tumbling down once reality strikes. The lessons of history demonstrate that the fall of Rome, France, and the Soviet Union resulted from this very progression, trusting appearances and reputation rather than confronting internal decay. Today, America faces the same peril. The warning signs are all present: dwindling force size, aging hardware, strained alliances, and internal political discord. The recent Afghanistan withdrawal laid bare the fragile gap between perception and reality, serving as a stark reminder that the era of unquestioned American military dominance may be ending. The critical question is whether we can recognize these signals early enough to reverse course, or whether we will suffer the same fate as those civilizations before us. The pattern is clear, written over centuries of history. Without decisive action, internal revival, and restructuring, the decline is unavoidable. The sooner it's acknowledged, the better the chance to preserve what remains of American power before the entire edifice crumbles. Because once the cascade begins, recovery becomes exponentially more difficult, if not impossible. And suddenly, the emperor's falsehood was laid bare. He was exposed as having no clothes. That's when the acceleration of the pattern begins. Allies start to hesitate and hedge their commitments. Enemies test the boundaries of what they can get away with. Every promise, every guarantee becomes questionable. The once firm military, the backbone of security, turns into a liability. And the superpower that once projected force across the globe finds itself unable to maintain that power. What happens isn't just theoretical. History has demonstrated it clearly through Rome, France, and the Soviet Union, all of which fell into the same trap. They believed their military strength was everlasting, that their dominance was built to last. They let their readiness gradually erode behind a facade of strength, confusing reputation with real capability. The bitter truth only revealed itself when it was too late to recover. To understand how this repeatedly unfolds, let's examine how it happened 3 times, in exactly the same manner. Starting with Rome. From 350 to 480 AD, over 4 centuries, the Roman legions were considered unstoppable. They had conquered Gaul, Britain, Egypt, Judea, Greece, Spain, and North Africa. Any land that opposed Rome was subdued. Their armies were the most advanced of their era. Professional soldiers, uniform equipment, iron discipline, brilliant tactics. By the year 350 AD, Rome controlled a vast territory stretching from Scotland to Syria, ruling over 3 continents and around 60 million people. The military was the foundation upon which this immense power rested. Yet beneath this impressive reputation, the legions were actually decaying. Their greatest strength had been around the year 117 AD under Emperor Trajan, but by 350, they had been in decline for 200 years. No one wanted to admit it openly. Internally, the signs of decline were clear. Rome struggled to recruit enough citizens to fill its ranks. The old system, Roman citizens serving in the legions, had broken down. As citizenship extended to anyone within the empire, the traditional military culture was eroded. Why would a farmer in Egypt risk his life for Rome if he saw no loyalty to the empire? In response, Rome did what declining militaries always do. They lowered standards. They recruited barbarians, Germanic tribes, Goths, Huns, anyone willing to fight. By 350, more than half of the legions comprised foreign mercenaries who had little allegiance to Rome. Meanwhile, equipment quality declined as well. The standardized gear that once made the legions effective was too expensive. Armor became lighter, training shorter, discipline weaker. Despite these internal weaknesses, Rome's reputation endured. As the army moved, enemies retreated. The myth of invincibility carried by reputation worked as before. Yet, beneath the surface, the military strength was eroding. That all changed on August 9, 378 AD, in the Battle of Adrianople. The Eastern Roman Emperor Valens faced a Gothic army in Thrace, modern-day Turkey. The defeat was devastating. Just 32 years later, in the year 410, Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome itself, the city that hadn't fallen in over 8 centuries. It took only 3 days. The Western Roman Empire lingered on for another 66 years, but it was already a shadow of its former self. By 476, Rome could no longer field a coherent army. Germanic warlords commanded vast swaths of territory, and the empire, the superpower built on military dominance, collapsed because the military had ceased to be capable. The pattern had played out once again. Peak strength masked by internal decay, a decisive defeat exposing the truth, followed by collapse. The first major defeat lays bare the harsh truth. A cascade of subsequent defeats inevitably follows, leading to the collapse of an empire. Now, let's fast forward roughly 1,600 years to France in the year 1940. After the devastation of the First World War, France boasted Europe's strongest military. They had fought Germany to a stalemate for nearly 4 years and considered themselves victorious. French generals were celebrated as heroes, and their army was large, well-armed, and seasoned by war. By 1939, France had constructed the Maginot Line, an impressive fortress system along the German border meant to be impenetrable. Their military doctrine emphasized static defense, attrition, and safeguarding their territory under the assumption that Germany lacked the capacity to break through. The surrounding nations viewed France as invincible, relying heavily on their military strength. Britain trusted France's guarantees, Poland leaned on French promises, and Belgium believed in their assurances. Yet beneath this veneer of strength, the core capabilities had begun to decline. The fundamental problem was that French military thinking had not evolved with time. They persisted in planning as if the previous war was the only model, relying on static defenses, slow mobilization, and old-fashioned trench warfare. They ignored the lessons learned from mechanized warfare, holding tanks in support roles rather than concentrating them for swift strikes. Meanwhile, the Germans had advanced their tactics, emphasizing rapid, concentrated assaults supported by airplanes, punching through weak points and encircling enemy forces with speed, surprise, and precise coordination. Although the French had more tanks, larger forces, and superior firepower on paper, their tactics, command structures, and strategic thinking were outdated and rigid. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched its invasion. The world expected a prolonged, grueling conflict reminiscent of the previous war, lasting years of trench warfare. Instead, in just 6 weeks, everything changed. The Germans bypassed the Maginot Line through the Ardennes forest, something the French military officials dismissed as impassable terrain, and German panzer divisions broke through at Sedan. French defenses crumbled rapidly. Within days, German forces had split the French and British armies, leading to Britain's evacuation at Dunkirk. Paris fell, and the French government surrendered on June 22. The most formidable army in Europe was dismantled in less than 2 months, not just through a single defeat, but through total military collapse. The discrepancy between France's reputation and its actual military strength had become so vast that, once exposed, the entire military structure imploded. The real issue wasn't equipment. The French had tanks comparable to Germany's and more soldiers. The problem was that their doctrine, training, and command were stagnating, still rooted in the tactics of World War I, while their enemies had innovated. They had over-relied on outdated strategies, and their leadership was slow and inflexible. France's failure to adapt meant their military was rendered obsolete overnight. French military prestige was essentially permanently shattered. Although France was liberated by American and British forces in 1944, their status as a military power was lost, relegating France to second-tier status. Once a superpower, now a secondary actor on the global stage. This pattern repeats itself consistently. Reputation endures long after military capabilities decline. The first significant test of a military's strength often reveals the uncomfortable truth. Failure often comes suddenly and decisively. Consider the Soviet Union between 1979 and 1989. In 1979, their armed forces were formidable, comprising 5 million troops, possessing nuclear arsenals, and boasting the world's largest tank fleet. They had maintained decades of military dominance across Eastern Europe, presenting an image of invincibility. When the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, resistance was crushed within a day, reinforcing the perception that they were unstoppable. During that period, America was still grappling with the aftermath of Vietnam, and China was considered weak. Thus, the Soviet military was feared universally. However, everything changed in December of 1979 when the USSR launched an invasion of Afghanistan. Their objective was straightforward: install a friendly communist government, stabilize the country swiftly, and withdraw within months. Afghanistan's landscape was poor, divided, and technologically backward, making it seem like an easy target. The Soviets had modern equipment, tanks, helicopters, and advanced weapons, while the Afghan resistance fighters, known as the Mujahideen, relied on outdated rifles. Yet, 10 years later, the Soviets retreated in disgrace, with 15,000 soldiers dead, hundreds of thousands of Afghans killed, and billions in costs. The war shattered the Soviet military's facade. What went wrong? On paper, the Soviet forces appeared mighty, but behind the scenes, the reality was different. The conscription system created soldiers who lacked motivation. Morale was virtually non-existent. Rampant drug abuse, corruption among officers, and poor equipment maintenance all plagued the ranks. The Soviets attempted a conventional, mechanized warfare approach, bombing villages, occupying cities, yet they failed to control the rugged countryside. The Mujahideen, with American and Pakistani backing, adapted quickly, ambushing convoys, downing helicopters, and making occupation unsustainable. The Soviet military proved unable to win, and the prolonged conflict exposed systemic flaws: widespread corruption, incompetence, brutal tactics that fueled more hostility, logistical failures, and leadership failures. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldier left Afghanistan, and the myth of Soviet invincibility was shattered. The mighty army had been beaten by farmers armed with rifles. Once that reputation collapsed, the Soviet Empire dissolved. Observers in Eastern Europe watched in disbelief. If the Soviets couldn't conquer Afghanistan, how could they hold their European sphere? Within 2 years, the Berlin Wall fell, and the Warsaw Pact disbanded. By December of 1991, the Soviet Union itself had ceased to exist. This pattern was clear. Despite an internal crisis, their military reputation remained unshaken until the first major defeat, which then triggered a cascade of failures and the eventual collapse of the empire. Rome, France, and the USSR each followed this pattern, collapsing after their military fortunes declined under similar circumstances. And now, this cycle is repeating in contemporary America. To understand the pattern, it's essential to recognize its 6 stages. The first stage is peak military power, characterized by genuine dominance, cutting-edge technology, superior training, morale that is high, recruitment that is effortless, and equipment that inspires fear in enemies. Allies trust them, and the global perception is that their power is unstoppable. This was true for Rome around the 2nd century, France after World War I, the USSR mid-20th century, and the United States after the Gulf War in 1991. The second stage marks the beginning of internal decline, a process that unfolds subtly over time. It often begins with stealthy budget reductions presented under the guise of increasing efficiency, which gradually undermine the military's foundations. As financial constraints tighten, recruitment becomes increasingly difficult, prompting authorities to lower standards in an attempt to fill ranks. Meanwhile, equipment begins to age without timely replacements, leading to aging hardware that hampers operational readiness. Training quality declines, and bureaucratic inefficiencies grow, causing innovation and modernization efforts to slow to a crawl. These issues are typically concealed from the public eye, with military leaders insisting everything remains under control and functioning as it should. Historical parallels can be found in Rome around 250 AD, France during the mid-20s, the Soviet Union in the early 1970s, and the United States in the early 2000s, each reflecting the same quiet but relentless internal deterioration. The third stage sees reputation acting as a shield, masking the underlying weakness. Despite the internal decline, the military's image remains largely intact, and both enemies and allies continue to trust its name. Enemies still regard the armed forces with respect and caution, while allies depend on the security guarantees that are still in place. Yet, behind closed doors, military leaders are acutely aware that their actual readiness and capability have significantly diminished. Morale weakens, and the gap between facade and reality widens. It's a period when the reputation persists despite substantial internal flaws. Historical instances include Rome around 370 AD, France in the late 1930s, the Soviet Union during the late 1970s, and the United States in the year 2020, each showing that the external image can deceive even the most perceptive. The fourth stage arrives when a decisive defeat exposes the painful truth. The military, which was presumed invincible, fails a test that it should have succeeded easily. Whether it's a single crushing defeat or a failed campaign, such an event reveals that the empire's military strength is no longer reliable. This exposure shatters the illusion of invincibility, leading allies to question their commitments and enemies to test vulnerabilities. Suddenly, the long-held confidence in military dominance is eroded overnight. Historical examples include Rome's catastrophic defeat at Adrianople in 378 AD, France's rapid fall in 1940, and the Soviet retreat from Afghanistan in 1989. More recently, the United States faced an equivalent in 2021 with the abrupt collapse of the Afghan government, which had been extensively trained and equipped by American forces but fell within days. Following this exposure, a cascade of defeats begins to unfold. Allies withdraw their support, and adversaries become more aggressive, testing the limits everywhere. Each subsequent setback is more severe than the last, with some allies switching sides as trust erodes. The once feared military becomes a question mark, unable to fulfill its previous guarantees. The empire's influence erodes rapidly, shrinking its sphere of control from multiple regions down to core territories. Historically, Rome between 400 and 450 AD, France immediately after 1940, and the Soviet Union from 1989 to 1991 exemplified this downward spiral where the ability to project power effectively is lost. Ultimately, in the sixth stage, the empire can no longer sustain its military commitments. It becomes too weak to defend its interests abroad, and retreat becomes inevitable. Foreign bases are shut down, allies withdraw their support, and enemies act without restraint. The empire's global reach contracts to a defensive posture within its own borders, signaling the end of its era of dominance. Rome in AD 66 AD, France after the Second World War, the USSR at the end of 1991, and the United States of the future all serve as stark illustrations of this final collapse, each superpower succumbing to a pattern that repeats across history. This sequence spans different epochs. Rome's decline took about 100 years from the start of Stage 4. France's collapse happened in just 1 year, the Soviet Union's unraveling over 2, with each collapse accelerating more rapidly than the last. The pattern's consistency is unmistakable, and the United States currently finds itself at the Stage 4 threshold. The evidence for this is compelling. In 1991, during the Gulf War, the United States demonstrated peak military power, swiftly destroying the world's fourth-largest army in less than 100 hours through flawless use of precision weapons and overwhelming air superiority. At that moment, the U.S. military was unmatched, capable of fighting and winning 2 major conflicts simultaneously. This was creation of the pinnacle of American dominance, a true demonstration of military superiority. However, the quiet beginnings of decline appeared around 2005, as the global conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan stretched U.S. forces thin. Equipment aged faster than it could be replaced, and large portions of the defense budget were diverted to ongoing operations rather than modernization. The production of advanced aircraft like the F-22 was cut short, while the Navy shrank significantly, and the Army was downsized, all while expertise and readiness eroded. By 2020, the narrative of unrivaled military strength persisted, but internally, significant problems loomed: recruitment difficulties, aging hardware, and stretched supplies. The situation worsened dramatically in August of 2021, with the collapse of Afghanistan after 20 years and billions spent. The Afghan army, meticulously trained and equipped by the United States, fell in just 11 days to a Taliban force with rudimentary weapons and no air force. Scenes of chaos and catastrophe at Kabul airport underscored the stark reality. The world's most powerful military had been defeated by insurgents with rifles and improvised bombs. This ignited global concern, as adversaries like China and Russia observed weakness exposed under the guise of strength. And the warning signs continue to mount. Recruitment deficits, aging equipment, such as bombers from the 1950s and missiles from the 1970s, are glaring indicators of internal decay. The fleet is shrinking, and readiness is decreasing, with many aircraft and ships grounded for maintenance far more often than they are operational. Budget figures, although large in total, are heavily skewed toward personnel costs and operations, with only a fraction directed toward modernization. Technological threats, like hypersonic missiles, now challenge the U.S. advantage, and adversaries are closing the gap in drone technology, jamming, and missile defense systems. Within the military, morale and trust are deteriorating. Suicide rates are at historic highs. Top officers are leaving for the private sector. Political and cultural divisions undermine cohesion. Meanwhile, alliances are fraying as some nations hedge their bets. Saudi Arabia, for instance, making deals with China, and South Korea developing its nuclear arsenal, uncertain of U.S. support. Europe's pursuit of strategic autonomy further signals doubt about American guarantees. This all indicators point toward the 5th stage, the cascade of defeat and disillusionment. Once enemies test American resolve across multiple theaters, such as China and Taiwan, Russia and Ukraine or the Baltics, Iran and the Gulf, North Korea on the peninsula, the U.S. cannot respond effectively in all areas simultaneously. Our military simulations show that we would likely lose a conflict over Taiwan due to logistical and troop limitations. Sinking a single aircraft carrier could shatter the illusion of naval supremacy, revealing the cracks in American power to friends and foes alike. The timeline for these developments is pressing. Rome took about 32 years to collapse after the sack of the city in the year 378, while the Soviet Union's rapid unraveling from Afghanistan to dissolution took merely 2 years. France, in contrast, surrendered after just 6 weeks in 1940. Each cycle accelerates, fueled by the speed of modern communication and the interconnectedness of today's world. The question is, how much time does the United States have? Perhaps 5 years, maybe 10, before the full cascade of losses and disillusionment unfolds. Once the pattern of quick defeats and retreat begins, the final stage, complete loss of global dominance, becomes inevitable. Bases shut down, alliances weaken, and the military pulls back to defend only its homeland, ending the era of American superpower status. This outcome is not predetermined. It can be prevented, but only if the U.S. confronts the reality of its internal decline instead of denying it. Historically, superpowers like Rome, France, and the Soviet Union failed because they believed their reputation was enough to sustain them, ignoring the mounting internal problems. They clung to their self-image and ignored warning signs, ultimately leading to their downfall. The pattern is rooted in mathematical reality. A superpower cannot maintain global dominance when its military is hollowed out, its equipment outdated, and its capacity to project power diminished. Ultimately, the current trajectory of the United States mirrors these past collapses. The warning signs, aging hardware, recruitment shortfalls, declining readiness, eroding technological advantage, and fragile alliances, are flashing red. The decisive moment was 2021, and the subsequent challenges suggest that the cycle is already underway. The big question remains: how quickly will the decline accelerate? And will anyone accept reality before it's too late? Recognizing this pattern and acting decisively may be the only way to alter its course, but time is running out. The conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan dragged on for years, leaving the U.S. military stretched dangerously thin. Equipment deteriorated more rapidly than it could be replaced, and despite a hefty defense budget, most funds were diverted to ongoing operations rather than modernization efforts. The F-22 fighter jets, for instance, had their production halted prematurely, while the Navy's fleet dwindled from 600 ships to fewer than 300, a size not seen since before World War I. Meanwhile, the Army's active personnel numbers continued to decline. Yet, official narratives insisted everything was under control, claiming improvements in efficiency and technological advancements that prioritized quality over quantity. By the year 2020, the U.S. military appeared to remain a formidable force in the eyes of many. China wasn't directly challenging us, and Russia was cautious in its moves. Our allies maintained trust in American security commitments. NATO believed America would defend them. Japan and South Korea depended on U.S. protection, and Taiwan trusted that we would intervene if China attacked. However, beneath this veneer of strength, internal problems were beginning to stack up. Recruitment difficulties mounted, with standards being relaxed to fill ranks. Equipment was aging, exemplified by the B-52 bombers, some of which had been operational since 1955, making them older than most pilots' grandparents. The Navy's fleet had shrunk to 290 ships, the smallest in over a century, while China's naval forces had expanded to over 350 ships. The Army reduced its active duty forces, yet the overall reputation of American military might persisted, fostering a false sense of security. Then came August of 2021. The collapse in Afghanistan, after 20 years of effort and $2 trillion invested, marked a turning point. The most advanced military in the world faced off against the Taliban, a force with no air force, navy, satellites, or advanced weaponry. Yet within 11 days, the Taliban seized control. The Afghan military, which we had spent 2 decades training and equipping, disintegrated instantly. Kabul fell on August 15th amid scenes of chaos. Afghans falling from planes and a frantic U.S. evacuation underway. 13 U.S. service members lost their lives in a suicide bombing. The last C-17 aircraft lifted off on August 30th, abandoning billions of dollars worth of equipment, helicopters, armored vehicles, weapons, and night vision gear, some of which the Taliban now possessed, even more modern than most of our allies. This was Stage 4, America's Adrianople moment, where the stark difference between our reputation and real capability was laid bare. After 20 years, we had failed to defeat the Taliban, and our once mighty military had been beaten by insurgents armed with rifles and roadside bombs. Just as Rome after Adrianople, France in 1940, and the Soviet Union following Afghanistan's fall, the global community took notice. China observed closely, Russia watched intently, and Iran understood the implications. Yet, This isn't just about Afghanistan. It's a warning that echoes through history because similar signs are flashing right now in America. A recruitment crisis is evident. The U.S. military is falling short of targets by 25%. Equipment continues to age. B-52 52 bombers from the 1950s remain in service, and many aircraft have an average age of more than 28 years, the oldest in our history. The Navy's fleet size has shrunk further, and the Army's troop numbers are decreasing. Despite all this, the illusion of unmatched strength persisted until it didn't. The lessons of history are clear. When a military's internal vulnerabilities become undeniable, the facade of invincibility crumbles, often suddenly. Our current situation mirrors previous collapses because the fundamental issues, shrinking forces, aging equipment, recruitment struggles, are all present. The question now isn't if decline is inevitable, but how soon it will become irreversible. Currently, the United States relies on outdated weaponry, with the Minuteman III nuclear missiles dating back to the 1970s. The average age of Air Force aircraft has now reached 28 years, making it the oldest fleet in history. Meanwhile, ships remain in service long after their intended lifespan, with aircraft carriers like the USS Nimitz, which is over 48 years old, still active and deployed. The failure to replace aging equipment quickly is chiefly due to broken procurement processes, where budgets are overrun and schedules delayed. For instance, the F-35 35 program is now 15 years behind schedule and has exceeded its budget by more than $183 billion, yet it still faces persistent issues. In stark contrast, China is expanding its naval capabilities at an astonishing rate, launching 3 aircraft carriers in the time it takes the United States to build just one. Its force structure is shrinking less than ours, with the Navy now operating roughly 290 ships, while China possesses over 350 and continues to build more. The number of American attack submarines has increased slightly from 41 to 49, but China already has 66 submersibles and is adding new ones rapidly. The Army has decreased from 566,000 active duty soldiers in 2010 to 452,000 today. Similarly, the Air Force now operates fewer aircraft than at any moment since its inception, making the force smaller, older, and more strained than ever before. Readiness issues have become severe. Only half of the Air Force's fighters are mission-capable at any given time, leaving the other half grounded for maintenance or repairs. Our naval ships spend less time at sea because of severe maintenance backlogs, while training hours are being reduced to save funds. Essentially, the military's ability to respond effectively is now weaker than it has been since the 1970s. Despite an annual defense budget exceeding $800 billion, most of those funds, about 80%, are allocated to personnel costs, benefits, and operational expenses, leaving only around 20% for procurement and modernization. This means we are investing more money but acquiring less, emphasizing a problem of resource misallocation. This imbalance is compounded by strategic overextension. With commitments across the globe, forces are dispersed so broadly that they lack concentration or effectiveness anywhere. We're strong nowhere. Meanwhile, technological dominance is fading. China possesses hypersonic missiles capable of sinking aircraft carriers, and we lack effective defenses against such weapons. Russia's jamming technology disrupts our communications and GPS systems, and our drones are being shot down in Ukraine, illustrating a decline in the technological edge that once defined American military supremacy for 3 decades. Some adversaries have even surpassed us in certain areas of innovation. Inside the military, morale and internal cohesion are deteriorating. Suicide rates are reaching record highs, and retention of top officers and non-commissioned officers is problematic, with many leaving for lucrative private sector jobs. Confidence in military leadership is waning, and political and cultural conflicts are seeping into the ranks, undermining unity. Precisely the internal decay that brought down Roman legions and Soviet divisions before. Most tellingly, despite these internal struggles, our reputation remains largely intact, and our allies continue to trust American guarantees. Yet this trust is starting to fracture. Saudi Arabia is forging deals with China, the United Arab Emirates is purchasing Russian weapons, and South Korea is developing its own nuclear deterrent because of doubts about the U.S. commitment to defend them. Europe is increasingly talking about strategic autonomy, signaling a waning faith in U.S. protection. The long-standing reputation that kept adversaries cautious for 80 years is cracking, foreshadowing a potential shift in global power dynamics. Once the foundational strength of a superpower's military disintegrates entirely, it enters what is known as Stage 5, the cascade of defeat. At this point, adversaries recognize that American military power has become hollow and, en masse, will test its limits across multiple regions simultaneously. For example, China makes aggressive moves toward Taiwan. Russia advances further into Ukraine or the Baltics. Iran seizes control of the Strait of Hormuz, and North Korea acts provocatively against South Korea, all at the same time. Our military cannot respond effectively to all these threats at once because we lack sufficient ships, aircraft, troops, and weapon stocks to fight across several theaters simultaneously. Detailed military simulations repeatedly demonstrate that, in a Taiwan scenario, the United States would lose, not because China's forces are necessarily superior, but because we cannot marshal enough forces swiftly enough. The moment that China sinks a single U.S. aircraft carrier would shatter the myth of American naval dominance forever. This scenario is unfolding in real time. We are currently at Stage 4. The withdrawal from Afghanistan served as our Adrianople moment, revealing to the world that American military might is no longer what it once was. Stage 5, the cascade, is looming. It will bring with it multiple simultaneous crises. Allies will withdraw their security guarantees, enemies will act without restraint, and America will realize it cannot uphold all its commitments. Historically, the timeline for these patterns is startlingly short. Rome took around 32 years from the Battle of Adrianople to its sack. The Soviet Union collapsed within 2 years of its defeat in Afghanistan. France surrendered entirely 6 weeks after the German invasion in 1940. Each time this pattern has played out, it has accelerated because the world now functions faster. Information spreads instantly, and enemies coordinate globally with ease. How much time does America have left? Possibly 5 years, maybe 10. But the trajectory is unmistakable. Once Stage 5 begins, Stage 6, the final collapse of American global power, arrives swiftly. As the cascade unfolds, allies will withdraw, fearing their commitments aren't secure, and enemies will attack with confidence. The U.S. military will retreat to defending the homeland alone, as bases abroad are abandoned. The era of American dominance on the world stage will come to an end. This outcome is not inevitable, but halting it requires a level of honesty and action no declining power has ever achieved. Rome, France, and the Soviet Union all believed their military strength was everlasting. They thought their reputation would sustain them indefinitely. They all learned the hard way that reputation fades when power wanes, that they weren't immune to decline. The pattern is driven by incontrovertible mathematics. You cannot sustain a global empire when your military shrinks and weakens. You cannot project force everywhere if your force is diminishing. You cannot maintain readiness when aging equipment and recruitment failures compromise your capacity. And once your reputation is proven false through concrete defeat, it cannot be restored. This pattern has claimed the downfall of 3 great military powers, Rome, France, and the Soviet Union. Each convinced their military would endure forever, each ignoring the warning signs, each confusing reputation with real capability. When reality caught up, they all collapsed. The United States is now following the same trajectory. The signs are unmistakable. The challenge, and the opportunity, is whether there is the will to confront these issues before it's too late. The same warning signs are present, accompanied by denial and a familiar trajectory. Currently, we stand at the 4th stage out of 6. The withdrawal from Afghanistan marked our moment of truth, signaling the beginning of the 5th stage, the cascade of defeats. The 6th and final stage signifies the end of American military supremacy. The reality isn't whether this fate will unfold. History's pattern indicates it inevitably will. The real question is how swiftly it will happen and whether anyone will recognize and confront the truth before it's too late. If this perspective sheds new light on the true state of American power, it's crucial to pay attention. When Stage 5 commences, with the cascade of setbacks in motion, understanding what led to this point and why history's repeating itself becomes paramount. Because history has already written the ending, and unfortunately, we are now approaching it.